right? Because if I go into myself and I look at all the deep, dark things that make me who I am, that make me want to write, right? You might not like it, and you might not like me for putting it down, right? So the biggest obstacle for me has always been fear. And once I got over that, or I still continue to push through that, the writing, it flows so much better. I write with abandon. It's exciting, it's fun most of the time. So that's, I guess, the biggest gift or the biggest piece of advice that I can give anyone is to write without fear, or write as if you have no fear. Either way works. So I've written my entire life. I've always been a writer, but I let the fear of not being able to get a job. Everybody told me that if I went to college for an English degree, I would end up at McDonald's. Fear of failure, fear of looking bad, fear of disappointing others, fear of finding out ultimately that I am just plain not good enough. Stop me from writing. When I gave in to fear, I did nothing for many, many years. I went the safe route, went to college, got a degree in international business, got a job in accounting, got married, bought a house, had 2 kids, and buried one parent before I finally saw that something had to change. While walking on a beach in Oregon in September of 2009, I caught myself actively caught up in a fantasy where my family all disappeared. I ran through the ways this might happen, and the grief that I would feel, the loneliness I was already becoming familiar with since losing my mother. But in the end, I thought, at least I don't have to wait until retirement before I can do what I want. I was horrified and mildly excited. It dawned on me that I had many options, and that if I was looking at my life as being that gloomy, that hopeless, without writing, then I had to do something different. I began attending classes, conferences, keeping track of my hours, and hiring babysitters. This is a separate story, but what I wanted to say here is that the most important thing, I think, for me to overcome as a writer has been and continues to be fear. The pieces that I will read deal with grief and loss, and I will end with a humorous piece so we can leave here in a good mood. Each of these pieces, though at the time I wrote them were scary for one reason or another, in all cases, what they had in common was the fear of looking bad, of not being liked. If you really want to write well, write something that will matter to others. Write like nobody is looking. Write like nobody cares, because they probably don't. Be fearless, and if you can't do that, write as if you were unafraid. Let's see, okay, and there's 2 quotes that I want to read before I read my stuff. The first is from a local author, Jack Remick, who wrote this book called Blood, that if you have not read it, read it, you will know what fearless writing is. It's freaky and very, very cool. Too often today, the writer writes safe. Safe means repeating, imitating, copying himself, expecting nothing more from the form than what it is already given. In that system, the reader, too, reads safe. Safe writer, safe reader. Stalemate. The culture dies trapped in an unevolving writer-reader sterile world. And this is Jonathan Franzen. I keep this on my desk. Fiction that isn't an author's personal adventure into the frightening or the unknown isn't worth writing about for anything but money. So the first piece I'm going to read is called Expenses. There's a small part of this that will be, the stuff that's in here will be mentioned in my next piece, but I think these 2 pieces complement each other, and this one lends context to the next one. What I was afraid to admit at the time that I wrote this was the way that I felt happiest with my father when his mind started to deteriorate. This seemed wholly sick and wrong to me. Nonetheless, I tried to tell myself I was seeing a silver lining in the cloud that was his dementia. Through the process of writing this and revising it, I also found out a few things about myself and my relationship with my father and about growing up. When I was 11, I flew with my mother to visit my grandfather, who had recently had a heart attack. The day before we were to fly out, she began having illusions that my grandfather was already dead. My grandmother even had the family priest called to convince her that he was still alive, but my mother refused to believe this. My father told me later that he regretted sending me with her, but at the time I felt very grown up. I was honored that he could count on me to be with my mother during this time. Within 2 days of my grandmother's panicked phone call, my mother went from mildly confused to full-blown psychotic, raving at me behind the cold steel doors of the Missoula Psych Ward. This was her first mental break. She told me that she, like my grandfather, was going for a trip on the Astroplane and she didn't come back for 3 weeks. My father was the first to explain to me what manic depression was. 20 years later, I received a call stating that my father needed me. When I went to be with him, I had the benefit of 20 years worth of emotional maturity, plus 2 years of witnessing my mother's mental and physical decline. I was prepared, and that made all the difference. For months prior, I watched my mother wheeze her last rasping breath thanks to 2 packs of Parliament Lights a day and a caregiver who didn't take a sick day. In a few hours, I was on a plane bound for Raleigh, North Carolina. At the last minute, I decided against bringing my daughter. I had already hauled her through the last 2 years of my mother's life. It seemed she might need a break from crazy old folks. I feared what might be in store for me alone with my lovable but demented father. When I got off the plane, I wasn't sure what to expect. I saw them right away. My stepmother was intently reading a paperback, but right when I saw my father, and I had not expected this, his face lit up. He began a halting, rushed walk toward me. My stepmother looked up, and her relief was palpable. I have never seen her so happy to see me. Dad had never looked worse. His face was pale and drawn. He was thin, and indeed, when he coughed, his face froze in panic, and he gripped his chest, waiting for the next fit to occur. When it didn't, he focused on me again, silent but happy, tears streaming down his cheeks. I was tired, but looking forward to time with my father as well. We rode through the night with my stepmother at the wheel of her Toyota minivan. We had a 2-hour drive back to their house. "I see you lost some of that baby weight," she said from the driver's seat. I met her gaze in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, we started to go to the Y, all 3 of us. I like it. There's a daycare there, so I can drop her off while I work out. She likes it," I said, referring to my 2-year-old daughter. "Good," she said, and smiled. Dad stretched his hand behind the seat and groped in the dark for my hand. His was cool and welcome until his grip tightened so that his knuckles ground together. "Dad, that's too hard," I said, and patted his shoulder. His grip loosened, then he choked out a few small sobs and squeezed briefly once before letting go. "How much did you gain?" my stepmother asked. "About 60 pounds. "That was way too much," she said. This time I shrugged and concentrated on the small car dealers and diners on the side of the 2-lane highway, fading in and out of neon and sodium bursts of light. I had my father all to myself for the entire month. There were moments of sadness and longing, but I did not dwell on them. And even if I was only reminding him to brush his teeth, I was there with him and he needed me. I did not have to share his attention with anyone else. This was something I hadn't had since I was very small. It was fantastic. "You're a good daughter." Sometimes he said this absently with tears and laughter, or through a mask of concentration with long folds of skin bunching wet around his eyes. Every time, no matter how animated his features, or how little or how much he laughed at this, I remembered clearly a time when this was not the case and reveled in the freedom that came with those words. I remembered my mother's words then. "Your father was going to turn you over to the state of Maryland." That was always her first try. When that got no reaction, I had to stop him from punching me in the face that night and came home drunk. You probably don't remember that. She would continue listing the ways he failed me until she stormed off in a frustrated rage. When my father wasn't being told to fuck off by his 14-year-old daughter, he was composed and gentle, if not always accepting or attentive in the way I wanted him to be. My mother brought these things up particularly often around the time of his wedding. My sister and I were adamant that we would go, despite the offer of a new Mazda Miata for her and constant reminders of my father's failures where I was concerned. She even insisted that he had done something unsavory to me as a child and that I had blocked the memory out of my consciousness. I refused to dignify the accusation with a response or stay home as she so urgently wanted me to do. How could I when he wanted me to be there? As I drove with my father, I wondered what my mother would think now, watching over this scene. She was free of her mind and moods, her spirit one with the mountains and sky she so loved. I wanted to believe that with that came improved perspective. Dad and I spent part of one afternoon at a reservoir my stepmother told me he liked to visit. The descriptions could be taken straight from a 19th century poem. A small man-made lake lay surrounded by forest beneath a sky so light blue it was almost white. The lake's quiet was disturbed dramatically every so often by the shrieks and panicky movement of resident geese and ducks. He walked with his back bent forward and his hands in his pockets, looking at me uncertainly as he put one foot in front of the other for 10 paces, then stopped, looked around, distracted by a runner, then staring at me before pointing to a nearby bench. Big piles of pine needles crackled beneath our feet and brought me back to camping trips on Holland Lake when Mom would fry a trout crispy and scrumptious over a campfire in a blackened pan with a cold smear of butter from the cooler. Mom was so alive then, teaching me how to fish, swim, paddle a canoe, and she told the scariest stories around the campfire. She never minded then that Dad spent most of his time on those trips reading. That came later. By the reservoir with Dad, I was content. The scene was beautiful. I felt the presence of my mother near me, feeling the February breeze slip past us, toward my father, rustling his thin hair. I sat watching him admire the pack of geese on the water as they scrambled to take flight over his head. My stepmother returned and displayed everything she had purchased while she was away. I was touched by the number of items that were for me and my daughter. "Did you have to do a lot of haggling while you were shopping?" I asked as I tried on a large red and black sweater. "In the large shops you don't, but in the smaller bazaars they expect you to haggle." I was never any good at that in Mexico. It was always hard for me. I felt guilty. I figured they needed the money more than I did. "Oh no, it is better if you haggle. That way you make them feel like they have something valuable. Isn't it better to pay what they want than to lower the value, especially when they know that you can probably afford it?" I asked, trying to keep my face neutral. "That's not the point," she said. She shifted her weight and spoke more slowly. "It shows that you respect them if you are willing to haggle over the price. If you just buy an item outright like it's nothing to you, it's rude. It shows that you don't respect the true value they have put on the item they are presenting to you." That evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table covered with both open and unopened piles of mail. When she told me she wanted to reimburse me for the costs incurred with Dad, I insisted it wasn't necessary. She also insisted on paying me back for the cost to fix the van after my fender bender the day before. "That was my fault," I said. She wouldn't budge. "You incurred that while you were out here helping me. Tell me how much it is." "But I was the one who decided to take him out so much. I enjoyed it," I said. "Still, let me know how much it all came to and I will write you a check." "Really? Okay then." The list totaled more than seemed possible for the things we had done. I was shocked. "How does it look?" I asked, hating the false, cheery sound in my voice. She held the list I had put together. "It looks fine, she said. "You know, I really appreciate your coming out here for a whole month." "Well, I'm so glad I was able to do it," I said. I wanted to say more, but talk didn't feel right. It was too quiet. "The only thing here is that I would take off the $50 charge for the health club. I did leave you with those guest passes," she said. "There were only 4 of those. I had to go almost every day to keep up with what I was doing at home," I said, and then had no idea what to say next. I was frustrated that I felt I had to argue. I wasn't sure if that was expected or not. She lifted her shoulders and cocked her head. The amount for this charge was tiny compared to the total. "I can take that off, no problem," I said. I let out a breath and fell still again. As I climbed the stairs to the guest room, I thought about how, if I could, I would give 10 times that amount to have more time with my father. There are moments in time that, like childhood, are so fleeting. By their nature, you can never get back, no matter how much you pay. So that was that one. Does anybody have any questions? I kind of feel like being interactive, but no? Oh. Thank you for reading.
I have a comment. I think you do dialogue really well.
Really?
Yeah, I do. Your dialogue is really good.
Thank you.
It sounds real.
Thank you.
You started out talking about fear, a fear of what your family, did your family
the next piece I'm going to read actually goes into what happened when both my parents died. And I started thinking about my sister, and if she was, and I stuck one up on my blog too, and I thought, she may not appreciate having, you know, not that anybody else knows who she is, but that was one of the most difficult, intimate times in our family life, right? But I think our family is weird in a way too, because we've always sort of, not celebrated death exactly, but been aware of it and, you know, tried to go through it as sort of a life's passage instead of freaking out. Where when my father died, there were other family members that, you know, weren't our family. It was like my stepmother's family, and my sense was that they were not handling it right. And so I got a little upset with them. And that's part of this piece. But the other thing is that since both of my parents are gone, I can pretty much, especially my mother, who was, I mean, I'm not kidding, she could have ended up on the news. It was, you know, pretty bad. So if she were still alive and I was writing all this stuff, I'm sure I would be getting phone calls. But, you know, now I just have this nice fantasy that she's looking at me from the beyond and going, because I do remember that. She took a long time to die, and there was a point where I was writing a little bit, and I showed her a piece of it, and it was, you know, god-awful, this 12-page thing called The Drill, and it was horrible, and she said, well, I think you need to use it for a shopping list. And I was like, thanks. And I kept writing, you know, and then another time she just said, if you want to write, write. Because she had written all her life for different reasons. And I was still in that really stupid phase where I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be a writer, and was not writing, except for these spurts, you know, where once a year doesn't really count, you know.